We must tell you, before anything else, that Ruth Ann Calloway was 34 years old, and had exactly $11.40 to her name when the auctioneer's gavel fell on the last thing that had ever belonged to her husband. It was her husband's cousin, Silas Merrow, a man fattened on other people's misfortune, who had called in the note on their farm not 6 weeks after the fever took Thomas Calloway into the ground, and who stood at the back of the crowd that cold October morning in Coldwater Bend, Montana Territory, in the year 1887, smiling the smile of a man who believed the world owed him whatever he could take from it. With her $11.40, and with nowhere left to sleep that did not belong to someone else, Ruth walked past the grand parcels being sold that day, past the good land and the fine houses, and put her money down instead on a heap of blackened brick and rusted iron at the edge of town that folks called the old Hargrove Forge, abandoned some 15 years and sold for $4 because no one else wanted it. It was, by any sensible measure, a foolish purchase, a roofless ruin, a chimney full of swallows' nests, a floor gone soft with rot, but sealed behind the brick of that crumbling chimney was something no one living had known to look for. A letter, written in a dead man's hand, addressed to a name that had not been spoken aloud in Coldwater Bend for a generation. And it would not only change the shape of Ruth Calloway's life, but would settle a debt the whole town had long forgotten it owed. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway. If you have ever built something worthwhile out of what everyone else called worthless, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Ruth had not always been a woman who counted coins by candlelight. She had been born Ruth Ann Doss in the spring of 1853, in a cabin at the foot of the Bitterroot Range, the third of 5 children to a mother who sewed for the whole valley, and a father who broke horses for anyone willing to pay in coin, in kind, or sometimes only in gratitude. It was a hard household, but not an unkind one, and what Ruth learned there, before she learned her letters even, was the particular dignity of mending. Her mother could take a coat gone through at the elbows and set it right so cleverly that a body would swear it had come new from a Chicago catalog, and she taught Ruth, patiently over years of long winter evenings, that nothing was ever truly beyond repair if you were willing to look closely enough at what it had once been, and patient enough to bring it back. Her father, for his part, had a saying he repeated so often it had worn a groove in Ruth's memory. A horse nobody wants is only a horse nobody has taken the trouble to understand. He would take the beasts other men had given up on. The biters, the bolters, the ones with old wounds nobody had bothered to look under, and within a season he would have them eating from his palm. Ruth used to sit on the fence rail and watch him work, watch the slow unclenching of some animal's fear, and she came to believe, in the quiet way a child believes the things that are said to her most often, that value was not a thing fixed in an object or a creature, but a thing that could be uncovered, the way you'd uncover a good plank of oak beneath a coat of old paint, if only someone troubled themselves to look. She met Thomas Calloway at 19, when his family's wagon train paused near the Doss homestead to reshoe a lame team, and though he was a quiet man, slow to speak and slower to anger, there was something in the careful, unhurried way he worked with his hands. He had trained some years as a blacksmith's apprentice before his family took up farming. That reminded Ruth powerfully of her father, and she loved him for it before she rightly knew she loved him at all. They married within the year and took up a modest homestead outside a growing settlement that would come to be called Coldwater Bend, for the icy creek that curled around its northern edge, and for 14 years they built a life there together that was not grand but was, in every way that mattered to Ruth, whole. They had no children who lived past infancy, a grief Ruth carried privately and never let harden her, and instead she poured the tenderness she might have given a child into her garden, her hens, her neighbors, and into Thomas himself, who she nursed through 2 bad winters, and a broken leg and who nursed her, in turn, through a fever that nearly carried her off in her 28th year. She became known in the small, quiet way of a woman in a small town, as someone people came to when something needed fixing. A torn quilt, a cracked churn, a rift between two families who had stopped speaking. She never asked payment beyond what people freely offered. She simply believed, as her mother had taught her, that mending was its own kind of ministry, and she went about it without much thought of what it might one day be worth to her. It was Thomas's cousin, Silas Merrow, who first began to trouble that peace. Silas had come west some years after the Calloways, with little more than ambition and a gift for arithmetic that served him well once he took a position at the Coldwater Bend land office, and later, a controlling share in the town's only bank. He was not, in the beginning, an obviously cruel man. He was, if anything, unpleasantly ordinary, the sort who measured every kindness for what it might return to him, and who watched Thomas and Ruth's modest, contented life with an envy he never spoke aloud, but which showed, now and again, in the particular coldness of his eyes when the note on the Calloway farm came due for renewal, as it had come due every 3 years without incident since Thomas first borrowed against it to buy breeding stock. It was Silas, newly risen to a partnership in the bank, who reviewed the paperwork, and it was Silas who found or claimed to find some irregularity in the old agreement that gave him grounds to call the debt in full rather than renew it. Thomas argued the matter as best he could, but Thomas fell ill with a lung fever that winter, the same fever that had swept through half the valley, and he died in February of 1880, with the argument still unsettled, leaving Ruth a widow of 30, with a debt she had no way to pay, and a cousin-in-law who wasted no grief at all before pressing his claim. The fall, when it came quickly, the way a wall gives way all at once after months of quiet cracking. Ruth tried everything a proud and capable woman might try. She took in sewing and mending for the town as her mother had taught her, working late by lamplight until her eyes ached. But the money she earned was a trickle against a debt that demanded a flood. She sold the hens, then the good milking cow, then the modest jewelry Thomas had given her over their years together, piece by piece, watching each small sacrifice vanish into a debt that Silas Merrow seemed always able to find some new reason to keep growing. An interest charge here, a filing fee there, a penalty for a payment made 2 days past the date he himself had set. She went to the county courthouse and pleaded her case before a judge who listened kindly enough but told her, not unsympathetically, that the paper was the paper, and that he could not rule against what was written and properly signed, whatever the spirit of the original bargain might have been. And he had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would remember for years afterward, an expression that held no anger at all, only a kind of flat, satisfied patience, and told her that mercy was not a line item the bank's shareholders would understand. The farm was seized that autumn, the house Thomas had built with his own 2 hands, the garden Ruth had tended for 14 years, the barn where she had once watched him break a stubborn colt with nothing but patience and a low voice. All of it went under the auctioneer's gavel on a gray October morning, sold to settle a debt that had, by the time all the fees and penalties were tallied, grown to nearly 3 times what Thomas had originally borrowed. Ruth stood at the edge of the crowd in a coat gone thin at the elbows, watching strangers walk through her rooms, and understood with the particular clarity that comes only at the bottom of a thing, that she had nothing left in the world but $11.40, the clothes on her back, and whatever she carried inside her that no auctioneer could touch. It was while that same crowd was dispersing, murmuring over the prices fetched for good farmland and fine furniture, that Ruth's eye fell on the old Hargrove forge, standing forlorn at the edge of the auction grounds, included almost as an afterthought in the day's proceedings. Because the town council wanted the derelict lot off its books, it had belonged, a generation before, to a blacksmith named Ezra Wren, a man Ruth remembered only dimly from her girlhood as a great silent figure with soot, blackened forearms who had shod her father's horses, and who had, without any explanation the town ever settled on, packed up and vanished one autumn night some 20 years past, leaving the forge to fall into ruin, its roof caving, its chimney cracking, its floor given over to weeds and the nesting of swallows. No one in Coldwater Bend had wanted it in 15 years. When the auctioneer, more out of habit than hope, called for bids on the ruin, there was a long silence, broken finally by Ruth's own voice, startling even to herself, offering $4. There was some laughter at that. Not unkind exactly, but the particular laughter reserved for a woman thought to be grasping at scraps out of grief and desperation, which was not far, Ruth would admit later, from the truth. But nobody else bid, and the gavel fell, and Ruth Calloway walked away from the auction that had taken everything she owned, the legal owner of a crumbling ruin that most of the town considered good for nothing but firewood. She moved into it that same week, because she had, quite simply, nowhere else to go. The roof leaked over half the single room, so she set her cot beneath the sound half, and slept with her coat over the blankets. The old forge itself, the great stone hearth and iron chimney that had once rung with Ezra Wren's hammer, sat cold and choked with the debris of 2 decades, and Ruth spent her first days there simply clearing it, sweeping out swallows' nests and fallen brick, hauling away rotted timber, doing the only work she knew how to do in the face of ruin, which was to begin, patiently, to mend it. It was on the 4th day, while she was working loose, a section of brick near the base of the chimney that had bulged outward and threatened to collapse entirely, that her fingers found a gap where the mortar had been deliberately hollowed rather than simply crumbled with age, a cavity, no larger than a bread box, set into the brickwork and covered by a loose-fitted stone that someone had clearly meant to be found again, though perhaps not by a stranger, and not 20 years later. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept out 2 decades of Montana weather better than the roof above had kept out the rain, Ruth found a small leather-bound ledger, a modest but genuine folding of banknotes that made her breath catch in her throat, and a single sealed letter, yellowed but intact, on which was written, in a strong and careful hand, 4 words that stopped her heart entirely. For my daughter, Ruth. She sat on the cold floor of the forge for a long while before she could bring herself to break the seal, turning the letter over in her hands, trying to make sense of words that seemed to belong to some other woman's life entirely. Her father had been Amos Doss, the horse breaker, dead these 11 years and buried beside her mother at the little cemetery outside the valley where she was born. She had never in her life heard the name Ezra Wren spoken as anything but the town's vanished blacksmith. But when at last she broke the seal and unfolded the brittle paper, the story it told, in a hand grown shakier toward the letter's end as though the writer had composed it across several sittings, was one that rearranged everything Ruth had believed about her own beginning. Ezra Wren, the letter said, had loved her mother, Sarah, long before Sarah ever married Amos Doss, had loved her as a young man loves, entirely and without calculation, and Sarah had loved him in return, until Ezra's own father, a hard and unforgiving man who owned half the good grazing land in the valley in those days, forbade the match on account of some old grievance between the Wren and the Doss families that the letter did not fully explain, and threatened to ruin both families financially if Sarah did not break the engagement. Sarah, young and without means of her own, had done as she was told, and married Amos Doss within the year. And if she ever told him the truth of what had come before, the letter did not say. And by the time Ruth read it, there was no one left living who could confirm it beyond the letter itself. But Ezra wrote that Ruth had been born only 7 months after her parents' wedding, full, formed, and healthy by every account, in a way that a woman of the valley might quietly do the arithmetic on if she cared to, and that he had known, from the moment he first laid eyes on the infant Ruth Doss being carried past his forge in her mother's arms, that she was his own daughter, though he had never once spoken the claim aloud. Out of respect for Sarah's marriage and for the peace of a household he had no right to disturb. The letter went on, and here Ruth had to stop and press her palm flat against the cold brick floor to steady herself, to explain why Ezra Wren had vanished from Coldwater Bend so suddenly some 20 years before. He had spent the whole of his working life as the valley's blacksmith, and in that time he had quietly accumulated, through decades of careful, unglamorous labor and a blacksmith's natural distrust of banks, a modest fortune, which he had never spent on himself and had always intended, he wrote, for the daughter he could never publicly claim. But in his final years in Coldwater Bend, he had discovered that a rising young man at the land office, and here the letter named him plainly, Silas Merrow, was engaged in a scheme to falsify boundary surveys and quietly seize choice parcels of grazing land from smallholders, too poor or too trusting to check the paperwork closely. Land that Merrow would then resell at enormous profit once the railroad, which he had advanced knowledge of, came through the valley. Ezra had confronted him privately, hoping to shame him into stopping, and Merrow had responded not with shame but with quiet threats against Ezra's business and his safety. Threats Ezra took seriously enough, being a man alone with no family to protect him openly, that he judged it wiser to disappear than to fight a battle he could not win from within the town's own institutions. Before he left, he had hidden his savings in a detailed ledger documenting Merrow's fraudulent surveys behind the chimney of his own forge, intending to return one day when it was safe, or failing that, hoping that the daughter he had never been able to claim might one day, somehow, find her way to the very hearth where he had spent his life's work, and find with it both the means to secure her future and the means to see a wrong finally righted. He had died. The letter's final lines revealed, only 3 years after writing it, in a mining town 200 miles north, of causes the letter could not have known but which Ruth would later learn from an old acquaintance of his, were simple pneumonia, brought on by a hard winter and a harder life alone. He had never come back for what he'd hidden. He had never known whether his letter would ever find the daughter it was written for. Ruth wept that night, in a way she had not allowed herself to weep, even at Thomas's graveside. Wept for a father she had never known she had, and would now never know at all. Wept for a mother who had carried a secret sorrow through an entire lifetime, and never spoken it, and wept, too, with a fierce and unfamiliar anger, when she opened the ledger Ezra had hidden alongside his letter, and began to understand exactly what it documented. The handwriting was careful and precise. The entries dated across nearly 3 years, and they laid out, parcel by parcel, a pattern of falsified surveys and quietly altered boundary filings that had stripped no fewer than 11 families in the valley of choice acreage they had rightfully owned, land that Silas Merrow's bank had subsequently acquired at auction or through manufactured debt, in schemes that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the very trick that had cost Ruth her own farm. Among the names recorded in Ezra's careful hand, to Ruth's mounting horror and grief, was her own father's, Amos Doss, a smaller parcel, seized decades ago under circumstances the family had never fully understood, and quietly absorbed into land Silas Merrow's family had held ever since. The fraud Ruth had assumed was recent, born of one man's late life greed and directed at her alone out of some petty grudge, was in fact old, patient, and systemic, a slow theft practiced against an entire valley over the better part of 2 decades, and it had, by strange and terrible coincidence, come home at last to rest in the hands of the one woman in Coldwater Bend most equipped, by grief and by blood, to see it undone. The days that followed were not simple ones. Ruth understood, turning the ledger over in her hands, that she held something of tremendous power. Enough evidence, if presented properly to the Territorial Land Office, to unravel Silas Merrow's fortune and his standing entirely, and enough hidden money, once she counted it fully, to rebuild not only her own life, but a good portion of what had been taken from her neighbors besides. But she understood, too, that a woman alone, newly widowed, recently ruined, and possessed of a story about a secret father and a hidden fortune that sounded, to any skeptical ear, like exactly the kind of desperate invention a ruined woman might concoct, would find it a very hard thing to be believed, particularly against a man as established and as careful as Silas Merrow had become. She spent a full week simply working, by day, at restoring the forge itself, patching the roof with salvaged tin, clearing the hearth, relighting, for the first time in 20 years, a small fire in Ezra Wren's forge, an act that felt to her less like practical necessity and more like a kind of quiet homage, while by night she copied Ezra's ledger entries into a fresh notebook in her own hand, cross-referencing what she could against the public deed records at the county courthouse, building patiently and without announcing her purpose to anyone. It did not take long for word to spread through so small a town that the widow Calloway had taken up residence at the old Wren forge, and less long still for that word to reach Silas Merrow, who came to see her himself on a raw November afternoon, ostensibly to inquire, with false neighborly concern, whether she was managing all right in such rough quarters. But in truth, Ruth understood within moments, to assess whether she had found anything at the forge worth his attention. She gave nothing away that day, offering him only coffee and the composed, unreadable politeness her mother had taught her was a woman's surest shield. But she saw, in the sharp, searching way his eyes moved over the newly cleared hearth and the freshly mortared chimney, that he suspected something, and she understood that she did not have unlimited time to build her case before he moved to protect himself. Within days, rumors began circulating through Coldwater Bend that the widow Calloway was not quite right in her mind since her husband's death, that grief had unsettled her, that she had been overheard talking to herself in the ruin she'd bought, and was, some said with more cruelty than concern, likely to end up a danger to herself out there alone with no family to look after her. Rumors that had the unmistakable fingerprints of a man skilled at protecting his interests by discrediting anyone who threatened them. When Ruth attempted to bring her copied ledger entries and her account of Ezra's fraud discovery to the county land office, the clerk on duty, a young man clearly instructed by someone above him, told her the office could not act on private papers and unverified claims about surveys filed and closed decades before, and suggested, not unkindly but firmly, that she would need considerably more than a widow's word and an old man's handwriting to reopen matters long settled. It was in this discouraging season, when Ruth had begun to wonder whether Ezra's careful evidence would simply die a second, quieter death in a drawer of her own making, that she found an unexpected ally in Hollis Pratt, the elderly former county surveyor whose own signature, she discovered upon close study of the ledger, appeared on several of the original honest surveys that had later been secretly altered after leaving his hands. Hollis had retired some years before under circumstances the town understood only vaguely as ill health, but which he confessed to Ruth once she had gathered the courage to visit him and lay Ezra's ledger before him, had in truth been a quiet resignation forced upon him after he began raising uncomfortable questions about discrepancies in boundary filings he was certain he had never made himself. He had lacked, at the time, any proof beyond his own memory and professional instinct, and had been made to feel, by men more powerful than himself, Ezra's ledger, with its precise dates and documented alterations, was the very proof Hollis had needed and never found. And the old surveyor wept unashamedly when he understood at last that he had not been mistaken, and that his name might yet be cleared alongside the valleys. Together, Ruth and Hollis spent the better part of a month quietly gathering corroborating witnesses. The Faraday family, who had lost grazing land to a survey Hollis, now swore he had never filed as it appeared in the county's official record. Old Mrs. Okafor, whose late husband had complained bitterly for years about a boundary line that made no sense against the creek's natural course, and several others whose stories, taken alone, had seemed like the isolated grievances of unlucky families, but which, laid side by side with Ezra's ledger and Hollis's testimony, formed an unmistakable pattern that no honest official could dismiss. The conflict came to its head on a bitter January afternoon when Silas Merrow, sensing at last that Ruth's quiet inquiries had grown into something he could no longer discredit, through rumor alone, moved to have her removed from the forge entirely, filing a claim before the same county judge who had once denied Ruth's plea over her farm, arguing that the original sale of the derelict property had been improperly conducted and ought to be voided, and that the land, given its history and location, rightfully belonged to the town, which was to say, given the composition of the town council at that time, effectively to interests aligned with his own bank. It was a bold, and Ruth understood, a desperate move, the act of a man who had begun to feel the ground shifting beneath him, and who hoped to seize back control of the very hearth where the evidence against him had been found, before that evidence could be properly presented. The hearing was set for the following week, and Ruth understood that it would decide a great deal more than the ownership of a ruined forge. It would decide whether Ezra Wren's 20-year-old evidence and the testimony of a dozen wronged families would ever see honest daylight at all, or whether it would be quietly buried a second time by the same power that had buried it once before. Ruth walked into that county courthouse on the appointed morning, with Hollis Pratt at her side and Ezra's original ledger, alongside her own carefully referenced copy in a satchel she held against her like something precious, which indeed it was. She had dressed simply but with care, in the one good dress that had survived the auction of her old life, and though her hands trembled as she rose to speak, her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that surprised even herself, carrying in it something of her mother's patient dignity and something, too, of a father's quiet, unshakable steadiness that she was only now, for the first time, coming to understand as her own inheritance. She did not speak first of herself, of her own loss or her own claim to the forge. She spoke instead methodically, and without flourish, of 11 families whose land had been quietly taken from them across 2 decades through falsified surveys, naming each family and each parcel in turn, and calling forward, one by one, the witnesses she and Hollis had gathered, until the small courtroom which had gathered expecting only a minor property dispute, sat in a silence thick with dawning understanding. Silas Merrow, seated with his lawyer near the front, grew visibly paler as each testimony was laid before the judge, and when Hollis Pratt himself rose, an old man whose professional integrity had been quietly destroyed years before, and who now, at last, had the evidence to reclaim it, and confirmed under oath that the surveys in the ledger had indeed been altered after leaving his own honest hand. The room's mood shifted entirely from curiosity to something closer to outrage. It was only at the very end, once the pattern of the fraud stood undeniable before the court, that Ruth spoke at last of Ezra Wren, and of the letter he had left for a daughter he had never been permitted to claim. And there was not a person in that courtroom, by the time she finished, whose eyes were entirely dry, for it was, whatever else it was, a story of a father's quiet, patient, decades-long love finally reaching the child it had been meant for. His partners at the bank, unwilling to be tarnished alongside him, moved swiftly to distance themselves and his own name from the institution, and within the year he had left the valley entirely, a ruined man in the same manner he had once ruined others, though Ruth took no particular satisfaction in his fall, understanding, as her mother had once taught her, that justice done rightly needed no cruelty to make it complete. What mattered far more to her, in the months that followed, was what she was able to build with what Ezra Wren had left behind. She used a portion of his hidden savings to properly restore the old forge, not as a monument to grief, but as a working smithy once more. And she taught herself, with patience and no small amount of burned fingers, the trade her father had practiced there for decades, finding in the ringing of hammer on iron a rhythm that felt, to her, like a kind of conversation across time, with a man she had never had the chance to know. The remainder of Ezra's fortune, alongside a settlement eventually recovered from Merrow's forfeited assets, she directed not into her own comfort alone, but into a modest fund for the valley's smallholders, the 11 families and others besides who had lost land or savings to 2 decades of quiet fraud. A fund administered, at Ruth's insistence, not by herself alone but by a council that included Hollis Pratt and representatives of the families themselves, so that the restoring of what had been taken might belong to the whole community, rather than to any single hand. And so it was that Ruth Calloway who had begun that terrible autumn of 1880, a widow of 34 with $11.40 and nowhere to lay her head, came in time to be known throughout the valley not as a woman who had been ruined, but as the woman who had found, behind a crumbling chimney nobody else had thought worth searching, both a father she had never known, and a wrong that had waited 20 years to be righted. She kept the forge running for the rest of her working life, and it became, in time, something more than a smithy, a gathering place where the valley's families brought not only their horses to be shod, but their disputes to be mended, their doubts to be steadied, in something of the same spirit her own mother had once brought to a torn coat sleeve by lamplight, the quiet,
patient conviction that nothing was ever truly beyond repair if someone was willing to look closely enough and long enough to see what it had once been and what it might yet become. She never remarried, though she was not, by any account, a lonely woman, surrounded as she was by the family she had helped restore and by a community that had come, slowly and rightly, to understand what her quiet persistence had cost her and what it had given back to all of them. When she was asked, in later years, by younger women in the valley who had heard some version of her story and wanted to know how she had endured a fall so complete, she would only say, in the same unhurried way her father had once spoken of horses nobody else wanted, that she had simply refused to believe that a thing, or a person, cast aside by others was therefore worthless, and that sometimes the whole of a life's meaning could be found waiting patiently behind a wall that everyone else had long since stopped looking at. We began this story by telling you that Ruth Calloway was 34 years old and had $11.40 when she bought a ruined blacksmith forge that the whole town considered good for nothing but firewood. We hope you can see now why we told it to you that way, and why it matters that she bought it not out of foolishness, as the crowd that day believed, but out of the same quiet, patient faith her mother had taught her at a mending basket and her father had taught her at a corral fence. The faith that value does not announce itself loudly, that it waits, often, behind whatever looks most like ruin, for someone patient enough to come looking for it. What Ruth found behind that chimney was not simply a fortune, though it was that too, and not simply a father, though it was that as well, but a chance to do for an entire valley what her family had always quietly done for whatever crossed their path. To look past what a thing had become and see, instead, what it still might be, and to do the slow, unglamorous work of bringing it back. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Ruth Calloway's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that nothing forgotten is ever entirely lost. And we would love to know in the comments below What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had written off? We read every story you leave us, and we are always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.